My children abandoned me in a nursing home, but they screamed when I left $300 million to the janitor. She gave her life to raising them, yet they left her alone. Then the humble janitor showed her more love than her own family ever did. When the will is read, greed erupts, secrets surface, and one stunning decision changes everything. Who truly deserves her legacy, her children by blood, or the man who gave her back her dignity? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Margaret Lawson, 82, hummed softly as she slid the roast into the oven. Her arthritic fingers protested, but she ignored them. Today was special. All three of her children would be under her roof at once, something that hadn't happened in nearly 2 years. There now, she murmured, adjusting the temperature. Just like Charles always liked it. Her late husband had been gone 7 years, but she still cooked as if he might walk through the door, loosening his tie and sniffing the air appreciatively. The thought brought a sad smile to her lined face. The dining room gleamed. She'd polished the mahogany table herself, set out the good china wedding gifts from 1958, and arranged fresh flowers from her garden. The crystal glasses caught the afternoon light, throwing rainbows across the cream-colored walls. Margaret smoothed her dress and checked the clock. They'd be here soon. Michael, her eldest, always punctual. Susan, perpetually 5 minutes late. And Robert, who might arrive anywhere between 10 minutes early and half an hour late, depending on his mood. The doorbell rang precisely at 4. Michael. Mother, he said, barely glancing at her as he stepped inside, immediately checking his phone. The place looks quaint. Susan arrived next, air kissing Margaret's cheek. You really shouldn't be on your feet all day cooking, Mother. There are services for that now. Robert stumbled in last 20 minutes late. Sorry. Traffic was murder. Something smells good though. Margaret beamed. At least one of them seemed genuinely pleased to be there. Dinner started pleasantly enough. The roast was perfect, the potatoes golden, the green beans still had a satisfying crunch. Margaret had even made 3 different desserts, remembering each child's favorite. So, she said, refilling Robert's wine glass, tell me what's new with everyone. Michael cleared his throat. Actually, Mother, we need to discuss something important. The air in the room changed. Margaret's hands stilled on the wine bottle. We've been talking, Susan said, setting down her fork with a precise click against fine china. You can't keep living here alone. I'm perfectly fine, Margaret protested, her voice steady despite the sudden tightness in her chest. You fell last month, Michael countered. Once, and I wasn't even hurt. Next time could be different, Susan said. We've found a place, Magnolia Gardens. It's very nice. A nursing home? Margaret whispered. A retirement community, Robert corrected, looking uncomfortable. With staff to help you. I don't need help. Margaret's fingers trembled slightly. This is my home. Charles and I built it together. Michael's face hardened. It's decided, Mother. We've already made arrangements. You what? It's for the best, Susan said, her tone suggesting the matter was closed. We can start moving your things next week. Margaret looked at each of her children's faces. Michael, cold and determined. Susan, impatient. Only Robert couldn't meet her eyes. And what about the house? My garden? We'll take care of everything, Michael said. The property market is excellent right now. Understanding dawned like a cold winter morning. This wasn't about her safety. This was about money. Her home. Charles' legacy. I see, she said quietly. Dinner ended quickly after that. No one touched the desserts. They made vague promises to call, to visit, to help with the move. Then they were gone, the front door closing behind them with a final sounding click. Margaret stood in her immaculate dining room, surrounded by dirty dishes and half-eaten food. The house that had once echoed with children's laughter now felt cavernous in its silence. A single tear slid down her cheek. She wiped it away and began clearing the table. The next morning arrived too quickly. Margaret had barely finished her first cup of tea when the doorbell rang. She opened the door to find Susan on the porch, arms filled with flattened cardboard boxes. Good, you're up. Susan bustled past her mother without waiting for an invitation. We need to get started if we're going to finish today. Margaret stood frozen in the entryway of her own home. Today? But I thought, no point dragging this out, Mother. Susan snapped the first box into shape with efficient motions. Michael's arranged for movers this afternoon. I've already labeled which furniture goes where. But my things, you can take personal items. Of course, Magnolia Gardens has limited space, but they allow some decorative touches. Susan pulled open a kitchen drawer and began emptying it into a box. Though honestly, most of this should just be donated. Margaret watched helplessly as Susan moved through the house like a whirlwind, separating a lifetime of memories into keep, sell, and donate piles with ruthless efficiency. In her bedroom, Margaret sat on the edge of the bed she'd shared with Charles for 47 years. On the nightstand lay his Bible, worn from daily readings, and their wedding photograph in a silver frame. She gathered both to her chest. Susan appeared in the doorway. "Mother, we need to pack the bedding. And the movers can't take the mattress if you're sitting on it." "I'm keeping these," Margaret said, holding the Bible and photo tighter. Susan sighed. "Fine, but we need to be practical about everything else." By noon, Margaret's life had been sorted, labeled, and mostly packed away. She wandered through the half-empty rooms, touching door frames and window sills, saying silent goodbyes. The drive to Magnolia Gardens took 20 minutes that felt like hours. Margaret sat rigid in the passenger seat, the Bible and photo frame on her lap. Susan filled the silence with cheerful descriptions of the facility's amenities, none of which Margaret absorbed. Magnolia Gardens loomed ahead, a sprawling brick building with neat landscaping and a sign proclaiming "Dignity in your golden years." Margaret thought it looked more like a hospital than a home. Inside, a smiling woman named Brenda greeted them at the reception. "Welcome to Magnolia Gardens, Mrs. Lawson. We're so excited to have you join our family." Margaret nodded silently as Brenda led them down a long corridor. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and overcooked vegetables. "Here we are, room 215. Brenda unlocked the door with flourish. "Your new home." The room was painfully neutral: beige walls, beige curtains, beige carpet. A single bed stood against one wall, beside a small nightstand and lamp. A television was mounted opposite. A tiny bathroom occupied one corner. "It's very clean," Margaret managed. "The movers brought your chair and a few other things earlier," Susan pointed out. "And look, there's a nice view of the parking lot." Margaret placed Charles's Bible and their wedding photo on the nightstand, the only familiar objects in this sterile space. "Well," Susan checked her watch, "I should get going. You'll settle in quickly, I'm sure." The goodbye was brief. Susan promised to call soon, though they both knew she wouldn't. Then Margaret was alone. That evening, after a bland dinner in a crowded dining hall full of strangers, Margaret returned to room 215. She sat on the unfamiliar bed with its stiff sheets and reached for Charles' Bible. Opening to Psalms, she traced his underlined passages with her fingertip. In the darkness of this strange room, she whispered, "Lord, give me strength. I don't understand why my children have done this, but please help me find purpose here." The silence that followed felt less empty somehow. Margaret woke with a start, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar ceiling above her. A steady beeping from the hallway mingled with muffled voices and the squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum. The events of yesterday crashed back her children. The boxes, this place, Magnolia Gardens, her new home. She turned to check the time. The digital clock read 6:18 a.m., far earlier than she usually rose. But sleep had been fitful at best on the thin mattress that felt nothing like her bed of 40 years. Margaret sighed and pushed herself upright, wincing at the stiffness in her joints. The morning routine took longer than expected. Everything was arranged differently, and she fumbled through unfamiliar drawers searching for her hairbrush. By the time she dressed in a pale blue blouse and navy slacks, a chime sounded in the hallway. "Breakfast is served from 7:00 to 8:30. A voice announced over an intercom. Margaret smoothed her silver hair and straightened her shoulders. Perhaps breakfast would offer a chance to meet people, make connections, find a way to belong. The dining room buzzed with subdued activity, the clatter of utensils, occasional coughs, and the low murmur of conversation. Margaret hesitated at the entrance, uncertain where to sit. A young attendant noticed her. "Mrs. Lawson, you can sit anywhere. Today's breakfast is scrambled eggs or oatmeal." Margaret chose a table where three elderly women sat. May I join you? They glanced up briefly, nodded, then returned to their food. Margaret settled into the empty chair and attempted conversation. I'm Margaret. I just arrived yesterday. The woman nearest her looked up. I'm Edith. Nothing more followed. Lovely to meet you, Edith. Have you been here long? 3 years. Edith returned to her oatmeal. Margaret tried again with the others. The garden outside looks quite pretty. It's all right, one woman muttered without looking up. The third woman wore hearing aids and simply smiled vaguely in Margaret's direction. Margaret ate her tasteless eggs in silence, watching the room. Everyone seemed locked in their own worlds, some staring vacantly, others methodically eating without enjoyment. Was this what awaited her? This slow dissolution of personhood? After breakfast, Margaret wandered the halls, reading activity notices on bulletin boards and peering into empty common rooms. No one acknowledged her. Staff members bustled past with preoccupied expressions. Other residents shuffled along, eyes downcast. By mid-morning, she retreated to her room, the weight of invisibility pressing on her chest. The beige walls seemed to close in, mocking her attempts at optimism. She sat heavily in the chair by the window, watching raindrops streak the glass. So this was aging becoming transparent, fading from sight while still breathing. A gentle knock preceded the door opening. A man in gray maintenance clothes entered with a mop and bucket. Sorry to disturb you, ma'am. Just need to clean the floors. Margaret nodded, pulling her feet back to make room. The janitor worked efficiently, moving from the doorway toward the bathroom. As he passed, he glanced at the photo on her nightstand. That your husband? He asked. The question, this simple acknowledgement of her existence, nearly brought tears to her eyes. Yes, Charles. The janitor nodded, a genuine smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. Handsome man. You make a fine couple. He finished mopping, then paused at the door. Good morning, Miss Margaret. Hope tomorrow brings sunshine. Long after he'd gone, the warmth of those words remained. Miss Margaret, not room 215, not the new arrival. He'd truly seen her, and spoke her name with dignity. That night, as Margaret prepared for bed, she found herself thinking of the janitor's kind eyes. In this place where she'd felt invisible all day, his simple greeting had anchored her to the world of the living. The following afternoon, Margaret sat in her chair by the window, watching raindrops race down the glass. The weather matched her mood, gray and unsettled. Her second night had been no better than the first, filled with unfamiliar sounds and the occasional cry from down the hall. She shivered and reached for her sweater on the back of the chair. Her arm caught the Bible resting on the windowsill, sending it tumbling to the floor. The worn leather volume landed with a dull thud, pages splaying open. Margaret sighed. Her knees protested at the thought of bending down. A knock at the door interrupted her dilemma. The janitor from yesterday entered with cleaning supplies. Afternoon, Miss Margaret. Just need to empty your trash. Please, come in. Her voice sounded small even to her own ears. He spotted the fallen Bible and immediately set his supplies down. Let me get that for you. The janitor knelt beside her chair, gently collecting the Bible. As he lifted it, he paused, noticing the fragile pages and the handwritten notes in the margins. This looks well loved, he said, carefully closing it. 47 years of Sundays, Margaret replied. And most evenings, too. He handed it back with reverence, his weathered hands contrasting with the soft leather. My wife had one just like it, verses underlined in blue pencil, notes everywhere. Had? Margaret asked softly. She passed 5 years ago. Cancer. He straightened up but didn't immediately return to his work. I'm James, by the way. James Walker. Margaret Lawson. She gestured to the chair opposite. Would you have a moment to sit? James glanced at his watch, then nodded. A few minutes won't hurt. He settled into the chair, his tall frame making the furniture seem smaller. Margaret clutched her Bible, finding comfort in its familiar weight. You mentioned your wife yesterday, she ventured. Did you have children? James's face softened. One daughter, Anna. A shadow crossed his features. Lost her 3 years ago. Car accident. But she left behind my granddaughter, Lily. I'm so sorry, Margaret whispered. Lily's 17 now, smart as a whip, wants to be a nurse. Pride replaced the sorrow in his voice. working extra shifts to help her with college applications. Margaret nodded, watching his face illuminate when speaking of his granddaughter. What about you, Miss Margaret? Your family visit often? The question stung, but something in James's gentle manner made Margaret answer honestly. My children are busy. They thought this place would be best for me. James listened without interrupting, his eyes never leaving her face. When she faltered, he didn't rush to fill the silence. He simply waited, giving her words space to breathe. Charles, my husband passed 8 years ago, she continued. Sometimes I still expect to hear his key in the lock. That never quite goes away, James agreed. Sometimes I still make 2 cups of coffee in the morning. Margaret found herself telling James about Charles's love of fishing, of grandchildren who barely knew her now, of the home she'd left behind. He listened, truly listened in a way no one had in years. When his watch beeped, James stood reluctantly. Duty calls. But I enjoyed our talk, Miss Margaret. As did I, she replied. After he left, Margaret realized she'd spoken more in those few minutes than in the past 2 days combined. For the first time since arriving at Magnolia Gardens, her face relaxed into a faint smile. Someone had seen her not as room 215, not as another task to complete, but as Margaret. Margaret woke to the same institutional sounds that had greeted her every morning since arriving at Magnolia Gardens. The squeak of mag-cart wheels, the muted television from next door, the efficient rap of knuckles as staff performed their morning checks. She kept her eyes closed, postponing the moment when she'd have to acknowledge another day in this strange place. A faint, sweet scent tickled her nose. Something different. Something that didn't belong among the antiseptic smells of the nursing home. Margaret opened her eyes and turned toward her nightstand. There, in the humble bundle tied with what looked like a piece of twine, sat a small bouquet of wildflowers, purple coneflowers, black-eyed Susans, and delicate Queen Anne's lace. Their bright colors stood in defiance against the beige walls. She pushed herself upright, reaching for the flowers. The petals felt soft beneath her fingers, still holding morning dew. A memory surfaced, Charles bringing her daisies from their garden every Sunday morning. Her throat tightened. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Come in, she called, quickly dabbing at her eyes. James entered with his cleaning supplies, a warm smile lighting his face when he noticed the flowers in her hands. The garden out back needed trimming, he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Seemed a shame to waste them. Margaret clutched the simple bouquet. They're beautiful. James, thank you. He nodded toward the bathroom. There's a water glass in there that might work as a vase. After he finished his rounds, Margaret carefully arranged the wildflowers in the glass. She placed them where sunlight from the window caught their colors, casting tiny prism-like shadows across her bedside table. The morning passed with the usual routine, a bland breakfast, a physical therapy session she endured rather than enjoyed, and a recreation hour where residents sat in a circle barely engaging with each other. But throughout it all, Margaret found herself thinking of those flowers and the kindness behind them. At lunch, she noticed a few of the staff glancing her way, whispering. The head nurse, Alan, stopped by her table. Those are lovely flowers in your room, Mrs. Lawson. Did your family bring them? Something made Margaret hesitate before answering. No, just a small gift from a friend. Alan's eyebrows rose slightly, but she only nodded and moved on. Dinner came on the same institutional tray, overcooked vegetables, dried chicken, and a square of yellow cake. Margaret ate methodically, watching other residents with their visitors. One elderly man's daughter fed him small bites while updating him about his grandchildren. A woman across the room shared dinner with her husband, their hands occasionally meeting across the table. Margaret's table remained empty, but as she glanced toward the doorway, she caught sight of James pushing his cart down the hall. He didn't enter the dining room, but he gave her a small wave when their eyes met. She waved back, surprising herself with the gesture. Back in her room that evening, Margaret sat by the window with her Bible open in her lap. The fading light caught the wildflowers, making them glow like tiny lanterns. She realized she hadn't turned on her television all day, hadn't needed the noise to fill the silence. Instead, her thoughts kept returning to James, his gentle hands, his stories about his granddaughter, the way he truly saw her. Tomorrow he would come again, and for the first time since arriving at Magnolia Gardens, Margaret had something to look forward to. A week passed, the days marked not by activities or meals, but by James's visits. Margaret found herself watching the clock, waiting for the familiar sound of his cart in the hallway. On Thursday afternoon, when he finished mopping her floor, she cleared her throat softly. "James, would you have a moment to sit? That is, if you're not too busy." He paused, leaning on his mop handle. "I've got about 10 minutes before I need to head upstairs." Margaret gestured to the chair by the window. "Please." James wiped his hands on his uniform pants before sitting, his large frame making the institutional chair look somehow smaller. The silence stretched between them, comfortable yet expectant. "Tell me about your granddaughter," Margaret said finally. "You mentioned her name is Lily?" His face transformed, years falling away as he smiled. "Yes, ma'am. She's 17 now. Smart as a whip, gets that from her mother." "Your daughter," Margaret prompted gently. James's smile faded slightly. He looked down at his worn work boots. "Sarah, my daughter passed away 4 years ago. Car accident on Route 16. His voice remained steady, but his fingers tightened on his knees. Drunk driver crossed the center line. She was only 33. Margaret reached across the small space between them, her papery hand resting lightly on his forearm. "I'm so sorry, James." He nodded, accepting her sympathy with quiet dignity. Sarah was a single mom. Lily's father wasn't in the picture. So after we lost Sarah, my wife and I took Lillian. "And your wife?" "Cancer, 2 years ago." James looked up, meeting Margaret's eyes. "So it's just me and Lily now." Margaret withdrew her hand, stunned by the weight of loss this gentleman carried. "Yet you remain so kind." James shrugged. "What else is there to do? Lily needs me strong." "Tell me about your work," Margaret said. "I notice you are often here very early." "I work 3 jobs, Miss Margaret. Here from 6 to 2, then security at the mall until 8. And weekends I do maintenance at the church." He straightened his shoulders slightly. "Lily wants to be a nurse. Already got accepted to the program at State. I'm making sure she gets there without Dad hanging over her." Margaret thought of her own children, their expensive educations, the trust funds, the opportunities they'd taken for granted. She thought of Michael's sports car and Susan's vacation home. "That's why your shoes." She began, then stopped herself, embarrassed. James glanced down at his boots, cracked and worn at the seams. "These old things? They've got another year in them at least." He smiled, no shame in his voice. Margaret stood suddenly, moving to her dresser drawer. She returned with a small tin, opening it to reveal cookies. "My friend Betty smuggles these in when she visits. Would you like one?" James accepted the cookie with the same dignity with which he accepted everything. "Thank you, Miss Margaret." As he took a bite, Margaret saw not the janitor in the threadbare uniform, but a man of immeasurable worth, a father still grieving, a grandfather sacrificing, a human being whose kindness came not from abundance but from deep wells of character. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked as he rose to leave. "I'll be here," he promised, brushing crumbs from his hands. Margaret watched him go, the cookie tin still open in her lap, her heart full in a way it hadn't been in years. Margaret settled into the nursing home's lounge, a warm paperback novel open on her lap. The morning sun streamed through the large windows, casting long rectangles of light across the carpet. She hadn't seen her children in over a week, not since they'd abandoned her here with practiced excuses about busy schedules. The nursing home administrator's voice drifted down the hallway. "Mr. and Mrs. Lawson, how nice to see you again. And you must be Robert? Your mother speaks of you often." Margaret's heart quickened. She set her book aside, smoothed her cardigan, and prepared to stand. But they didn't turn toward the lounge. Instead, their footsteps continued past, heading toward the administrative offices. "Is Mother expecting us?" Susan's voice carried clearly. "No, but I can call her room after our meeting," the administrator replied. "That won't be necessary," Michael cut in. "We're on a tight schedule today." Margaret sank back into her chair. They hadn't come to see her at all. The voices faded as they entered an office down the hall, the door closing behind them. Margaret stared at her book, the words blurring before her eyes. After a few minutes, she picked up her cane and made her way toward the hallway, telling herself she just needed some water. As she approached the administrator's office, the door slightly ajar, Her children's voices carried clearly into the empty corridor. The doctor says her heart is weakening, Susan was saying. Nothing serious yet, but at her age. Did you bring the financial statement I asked for? Michael interrupted. Papers rustled. The estate's value has actually increased since Dad died, Robert said. The stock market's been good to us. Laughter followed. Her children's laughter. Margaret froze, her hand tightening around her cane. To Mother, Michael said in a mock-toast voice. May she live comfortably, but not too long. More laughter. Michael! Susan's voice held amusement, not reproach. Don't be crude. But seriously, have you thought about what you do with your share? I'm thinking of buying that lake house. I've got my eye on a new yacht, Robert chimed in. Once we split the fortune, I'm headed straight to the marina. Just remember the tax implications, Michael said. We should meet with the estate lawyer next month to ensure everything's in order when the time comes. Margaret's heart pounded painfully in her chest. The cane trembled in her grip. These were her children, the babies she had rocked to sleep, the teenagers whose tears she had dried, the adults whose accomplishments she had celebrated. And they were sitting mere feet away, laughing about her death, dividing her money while she still breathed. She turned away, not wanting to hear another word. Each step back to her room felt heavier than the last. By the time she closed her door behind her, her chest ached with a pain that had nothing to do with her heart condition. Margaret sank onto the edge of her bed, one hand pressed against her sternum. Tears welled in her eyes, but didn't fall. Instead, something hardened inside her, a resolve she hadn't felt in years. Not a penny, she whispered to the empty room. Not one penny will they get. She thought of James, working 3 jobs for his granddaughter. She thought of his kindness, his dignity, his worn shoes and gentle hands. Margaret stood up, her back straight despite the pain in her heart. She wouldn't let them succeed. Her life's fortune would not reward their cruelty. She would find a way to stop them. Starting now. The nursing home quieted as night fell. Lights dimmed in the hallways, and staff spoke in hushed voices during shift change. Margaret sat by her window, watching shadows lengthen across the courtyard while her mind raced. The cruel laughter of her children echoed in her memory, each remembered word another crack in her heart. At 9:30, when most residents had retired to their rooms, Margaret reached for the phone on her nightstand. Her fingers trembled slightly as she dialed the number she knew by heart. Richard Harmon's residence, a familiar voice answered. Richard, it's Margaret Lawson. Margaret. Her lawyer of 30 years sounded genuinely pleased. What a delightful surprise. How are you settling into? I need to see you, Margaret interrupted, her voice low but firm. It's urgent. A pause. Is everything all right? No, she said simply. I need to change my will. Completely. The line went quiet for a moment. I see. I can come tomorrow morning if that works for you. The sooner the better. 10 o'clock? Perfect. And Richard, please be discreet. No one can know about this visit. After hanging up, Margaret pulled open her bedside drawer and removed her husband's Bible. She ran her fingers over the worn leather cover, finding comfort in its familiar texture. For 47 years, George had read from these pages every night before bed. She'd found it impossible to part with when Susan had packed up her home. Margaret opened the Bible to Proverbs, finding the passage George had underlined decades ago. A good person leaves an inheritance for their children's children. The irony wasn't lost on her. She thought of James Walker, the way he knelt to retrieve her fallen Bible without being asked. How he spoke of his granddaughter with such pride in his eyes. The extra minutes he spent in her room, not cleaning but truly seeing her when her own children couldn't be bothered. $300 million, she whispered to herself, testing how it felt. The sum that had made her children circle like vultures would transform James's life completely. The thought brought the first smile to her face since overhearing her children's conversation. Margaret reached for the notepad beside her phone and began making notes detailed instructions for Richard about the new will. No small bequest, no divided assets. Everything, every property, investment, and penny would go to James Walker, the man who had shown her more kindness in 2 weeks than her children had in years. When she finished, she tucked the notes into her Bible. Then, with careful deliberation, she took a pen and opened to the front page. In her elegant, old-fashioned script, she wrote, "To the one who showed me love when family did not. May this gift bring you the peace you've given me. Margaret Lawson." She closed the Bible and held it against her chest. For the first time since being abandoned at the nursing home, she felt a sense of control returning. Her wealth, accumulated through years, alongside George building their steel empire, would not reward cruelty and greed. Instead, it would recognize kindness and hard work. Margaret slipped into bed and switched off her lamp. In the darkness, a weight lifted from her shoulders. Tomorrow would begin a new chapter 1 where she reclaimed her dignity and legacy from those who had discarded her. Richard Harmon arrived at precisely 10 o'clock the next morning, carrying his worn leather briefcase and wearing the same reassuring smile he'd had since becoming the Lawson family attorney 3 decades ago. He nodded politely to the receptionist. "I'm here to see Mrs. Margaret Lawson. Private business matter." The receptionist barely looked up. "Room 214. Down the hall to your right." Margaret sat waiting by the window, dressed in her powder blue cardigan and pearl necklace. She'd risen early, determined to look dignified for this moment. When the soft knock came, she straightened her shoulders. "Come in, Richard." Her lawyer stepped inside, closing the door firmly behind him. His eyes took in the small room with its institutional furniture and the vase of wildflowers that seemed out of place. "You look well, Margaret," he said, taking the chair she gestured toward. "No need for pleasantries, Richard. We both know why you're here." He nodded, opening his briefcase. "I've prepared the documents based on our conversation. A complete revision of your will, leaving your entire estate to..." He checked the paper. "James Walker, currently employed as a custodian at this facility." "That's correct." Richard's expression remained neutral, though his eyes held questions. "Margaret, you understand this is quite unusual. Your children will certainly contest. My children lost their right to my consideration when they abandoned me here." Her voice was steady. "Besides, you've always said my money is mine to do with as I please." "Indeed, I simply want to ensure you're certain." Margaret smiled thinly. "I've never been more certain of anything." Richard produced the documents, explaining each page with meticulous care. Margaret listened, occasionally asking questions, but her mind was made up. When he finally placed the pen in her hand, she felt a moment of profound clarity. Her hand trembled slightly, the arthritis. Not doubt as she signed her name on each marked line. With each signature, the weight on her heart lightened. "It's done," Richard said finally, applying his own signature as witness. "I'll file these immediately." "Thank you, Richard." She handed him an envelope. "This contains a letter explaining my decision. It's to be opened only after my death." After Richard left, Margaret sat quietly by the window, watching butterflies dance in the courtyard garden. For the first time since arriving at the nursing home, she felt peace settle over her. Her fortune would not reward those who saw her as merely a vault to be emptied. Instead, it would bless the man who saw her as human. That evening, James came by as usual to empty her trash and check if she needed anything. "Evening, Miss Margaret," he greeted, his work-worn hands efficiently changing her towels. "Gardens got the first monarch butterflies today. Thought you might like to know." "I saw them," she smiled. "Reminds me of when my George would go fishing at our lake house. He'd spend hours trying to catch the biggest bass, but would get distracted watching butterflies land on his tackle box." James chuckled. Man had his priorities straight. "Once," Margaret said, her eyes brightening with memory, "he fell right off the dock watching a swallowtail. Splashed into the water with all his fancy gear. They both laughed, the sound filling the small room with warmth. Your husband sounds like he knew what mattered," James said, pausing his work. "He did." Margaret's smile was genuine. "And so do you, James Walker." They shared another laugh about George's fishing mishaps as evening settled over the nursing home, neither aware of how their lives had been irrevocably linked that morning with the stroke of a pen. 3 days after changing her will, Margaret stood in the doorway of the nursing home's community lounge, surveying the empty space with its worn couches and dusty fake plants. The television droned on unwatched, while 2 residents dozed in opposite corners. "This simply won't do," she murmured. Margaret marched to the nurse's station, where a young aide named Tina was filing paperwork. I'd like to host a small gathering in the lounge this afternoon. Nothing fancy, just some conversation and perhaps a few hymns. Tina looked up, surprised. That's actually a wonderful idea, Mrs. Lawson. I'll mention it during lunch. By 2 o'clock, Margaret had arranged the furniture in a loose circle. She spent the morning personally inviting residents, knocking on doors, and introducing herself with a warmth that caught many off guard. What's the point? Grumbled Mr. Jenkins, a former accountant who rarely left his room. The point, dear sir, Margaret had replied firmly, is that we're all still breathing, and that means we have living to do. To her surprise, 14 residents appeared, shuffling in with walkers and wheelchairs. Some looked skeptical, others merely curious. Margaret smiled at each one. Welcome, friends. I thought we might share some stories today. Maybe sing a few songs we all remember. There was an awkward silence until Doris, a tiny woman with cloud white hair, began humming Amazing Grace. One by one, voices joined in, cracked and wavering, but growing stronger with each note. James appeared in the doorway, pushing his cleaning cart. He paused, listening, a smile warming his weathered face. Margaret caught his eye and nodded slightly. 20 minutes later, he returned with a pitcher balanced carefully on his cart. Garden needed watering, he whispered to Margaret, setting down the homemade lemonade and paper cups. Thought you all might be thirsty with all that beautiful singing. The lemonade, tart and sweet with floating mint leaves, became the centerpiece of the gathering. Mr. Jenkins discovered he'd once lived on the same street as Mrs. Abernathy's cousin. Two former teachers compared notes on disciplining unruly students. Doris revealed she'd been a backup singer for a traveling gospel group in the 1960s. Tomorrow? Same time? Margaret asked as the gathering wound down. Heads nodded enthusiastically. The next day, 17 residents appeared. The day after, 22. James began bringing different treats, cookies his granddaughter baked, fresh strawberries from a farmer's market, once even homemade bread, still warm from his oven. You are breaking about 6 facility rules, Nurse Gomez whispered to him one afternoon. But her smile was conspiratorial. But keep it up. I haven't seen Mrs. Abernathy laugh in months. By the second week, staff members started lingering during their breaks. Dr. Patel joined them on Thursday, sharing stories of his childhood in Gujarat. The administrator herself appeared briefly, eyebrows raised in surprise at the laughter filling the normally silent space. You've brought life to this place, James told Margaret one evening as he collected empty cups. They're talking about you in the staff room. Margaret smiled, watching Mrs. Chen teaching Mr. Jenkins a simple Tai Chi movement. I spent years hosting charity galas and corporate dinners, but this, she gestured to the room filled with animated conversation. This feels like what I was meant to do. For the first time since George's death, Margaret felt the hollow space in her chest filling with purpose. She was no longer merely waiting to die, she was showing others how to live with the time that remained. Rain tapped against the window of Margaret's room, creating a gentle rhythm that filled the quiet space. Outside, the evening sky had darkened early, turning the nursing home grounds into shadowy silhouettes behind streaks of water on the glass. Margaret sat in her armchair, a crocheted blanket across her lap. The day's gathering had ended hours ago, but the warmth of community lingered in her heart. James had finished his evening rounds and stopped by her room as he often did before leaving. Quite a storm out there, he remarked, glancing at the window. Margaret nodded. Then her eyes drifted to her nightstand, where her husband's Bible rested. The worn leather cover had faded with years of handling, its pages yellow at the edges from daily readings. James, she said suddenly, would you mind reading to me? My eyes tire so quickly these days. He looked surprised but pleased. I'd be honored, Miss Margaret. What would you like to hear? She gestured toward the Bible. Something from there you choose. James carefully picked up the Bible, noting the delicate way the spine cracked as he opened it. Bookmarks and slips of paper jutted from various pages, a life documented in scripture. He thumbed through slowly, pausing when he came across a page with multiple underlined passages. Matthew 25, he said, clearing his throat. This was important to you? Margaret smiled. George read it often, said it guided his business decisions when others only cared about profit. James nodded and began to read, his deep voice filling the small room. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, his voice carried the passage with natural reverence, not performative but genuinely respectful. When he reached the verses about separating the sheep from the goats, Margaret closed her eyes, letting the familiar words wash over her. For I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me. James paused, his finger marking the place on the page. This reminds me of what you've been doing with the residents here, Miss Margaret. She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. And you, James. These words describe you perfectly. He continued reading, his voice growing softer at the disciples' confusion. Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you? Rain drummed harder against the window as James read the reply. Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. A comfortable silence fell between them. Margaret felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. The decision she had made about her will, it wasn't spite or revenge against her children. It was justice. It was right. Thank you, James, she whispered. Those words, they confirm what I already knew in my heart. Not understanding her full meaning but sensing its importance, James carefully closed the Bible and placed it back on the nightstand. Almost instinctively, he reached for Margaret's hand. She clasped his weathered fingers with surprising strength, the connection between them transcending employer and employee, wealthy woman and janitor. In that moment, they were simply two souls finding comfort in faith and friendship amid life's storms. Sometimes, Margaret said softly, God's message is perfectly clear, isn't it? James nodded, their hands remaining linked in the quiet sanctuary they had created. The days following their Bible reading took on a gentle rhythm that Margaret had not experienced since before George passed. Each morning, she woke with a sense of anticipation rather than the dread that had become her companion during those first lonely weeks. James arrived at 8 each morning, pushing his cart down the hallway. He no longer knocked on Margaret's door. They had an understanding. She left it slightly ajar when she was ready for company, closed when she needed privacy. Got something for you, Miss Margaret, he announced on Tuesday, presenting 3 yellow daffodils wrapped in a damp paper towel. First ones of the season poking through near the east fence. Margaret touched the soft petals. My mother always said daffodils were brave flowers, coming up when there's still frost on the ground. She placed them in a small glass vase on her windowsill, the third bouquet that week. The room now smelled of earth and life instead of disinfectant. Their routines evolved naturally. James brought flowers. Margaret shared the homemade cookies. Susan reluctantly delivered from her housekeeper's kitchen. Neither mentioned that the cookies came from a family who couldn't be bothered to visit. These snickerdoodles are my granddaughter Lisa's favorite, James said, brushing cinnamon sugar from his fingers. She's got her midterms this week. We should say a prayer for her studies, Margaret suggested. And they did right there by the cleaning cart in the hallway. Other residents began to notice. Mrs. Peterson from room 104 started leaving her door ajar too. Mr. Collins, who rarely spoke to anyone, began nodding at James in the dining room. On Thursday afternoon, Margaret sat in the day room sharing stories of her travels through Europe with 3 other residents. When James entered to mop the floors, she waved him over. James, tell them about that sunrise you saw on your fishing trip in Michigan. He leaned on his mop. Now that was something to behold. Sky turned this purple-pink color that reflected on the lake, made you feel small and important all at once. The residents hung on his every word. One by one, they began offering their own stories, memories, long buried under the routine of institutional living. James worked as he listened, but his presence was the catalyst that kept the conversation flowing. That evening, Margaret watched from her doorway as James helped Mr. Collins, who had dropped his glasses. The gentle way James knelt despite his own aching knees, The respect in his voice as he spoke to the confused older man, it stirred something profound in Margaret's heart. "You're good for this place," she told him later as he prepared to leave for his second job. "For all of us." He shook his head. "Just doing what anyone would do." "No," Margaret said firmly. "Not anyone. Not everyone sees people the way you do." After he left, Margaret sat by her window watching the sunset paint the sky in colors reminiscent of James Michigan's story. The nursing home no longer felt like a waiting room for death. Somehow, it had become a place where life still happened, where connections formed, and laughter echoed down sterile hallways. That night, as she settled into bed, Margaret looked at the daffodils, silhouetted against the evening sky. For the first time since arriving, she felt like she belonged somewhere, like she had family. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered into the darkness, pulling her blanket closer for sending him. Nurse Brenda Jenkins paused outside Margaret's room, frowning as she heard laughter inside. For the third time that week, James Walker was sitting in the visitor's chair instead of mopping the floor or emptying trash bins. She watched through the partially open door as he helped Margaret arrange flowers in a small vase. "He's in there again," she whispered to Diane at the medication cart. "The janitor, spending more time chatting than cleaning." Diane raised an eyebrow. "With Mrs. Lawson? The steel magnet's widow? Every day now. Bring her flowers, reading to her." Brenda's voice dropped lower. "She's got money, lots of it." "You don't think." Wouldn't be the first time someone cozied up to a wealthy resident. Brenda tapped her pen against her clipboard. "My cousin worked at Oak Ridge Home. Said they had a maintenance man who talked an old lady into changing her will, left him her beach house." The story traveled quickly through staff break rooms and shift changes. By afternoon, the director of nursing had heard a version where James was seen holding Margaret's hand and going through her personal items. Diane mentioned it to Carla, the receptionist, during lunch. "Someone should tell her family," Carla said, pulling out her phone. "I have her daughter's number from when she called about the DNR forms." Susan Lawson answered on the second ring, her voice sharp with irritation. "What is it? I'm in a meeting." "Mrs. Lawson, this is Carla from Pinewood Haven. I thought you should know there's a situation with your mother." "Is she ill?" "No, ma'am. It's about one of our staff members, the janitor. He's been spending an unusual amount of time with your mother, bringing her gifts. Some of the nurses are concerned he might be, trying to take advantage of her situation." The line went silent for a moment. "What's his name?" "James Walker." "I see." Susan's voice hardened. "Thank you for letting me know. I'll handle this." After lunch, Margaret noticed the strange looks from the staff. Nurse Brenda came in to check her blood pressure, her manner unusually stiff. "Is everything all right, Brenda?" Margaret asked. "Fine." Brenda avoided her eyes. "We're just concerned about you, Mrs. Lawson." "Concerned? Whatever for?" Brenda hesitated. "It's not really my place, but some of us have noticed Mr. Walker spending a lot of time here. We want to make sure you're comfortable with that." Margaret straightened her spine, the dignified steel magnet's wife emerging. "James is my friend. I enjoy his company." "Of course. It's just what, Brenda?" "Well, people talk about his intentions." Margaret's cheeks flushed with anger. "His intentions are to be kind to an old woman who's been tossed aside by her own children." When James arrived that afternoon, he found Margaret upset. She told him about the nurse's comments. "They think you're after my money," she said, hands trembling, as if kindness must have ulterior motives. James knelt beside her chair, his worn work uniform stark against the plush upholstery. "People see what they expect to see, Miss Margaret. Those who value money above all else can't imagine any other motivation. This will cause trouble for you. I'm so sorry." He smiled gently. "Let them talk, Miss Margaret. You know my heart." Margaret reached for his callous hand. "I do, James, and that's all that matters." Neither noticed Nurse Brenda watching from the hallway, her cell phone already in hand. A timid knock on Margaret's door pulled her from her afternoon reading. James stood in the doorway, his weathered face glowing with an unusual brightness. "Miss Margaret, hope I'm not disturbing you. My granddaughter Lily's stopping by today. Got some news she wants to share." Margaret closed her book and smiled. "Wonderful. I love to meet her. She's been asking about you too, all those stories I've been telling her." An hour later, Margaret waited in her room, having changed into her blue dress with pearl buttons, the one she'd worn to church before coming to Pinewood Haven. She'd even asked the aide to help pin her silver hair up properly. When Lily arrived, Margaret knew her instantly. The young woman had James's kind eyes, though her step had a youthful bounce his no longer possessed. Her braided hair was tied with a ribbon, and she clutched an envelope to her chest like a precious treasure. "Miss Margaret," James said. "This is my Lily." The girl stepped forward and took Margaret's outstretched hands. "Grandpa talks about you all the time. All good things, I hope." Margaret squeezed her hands. "Your grandfather is the finest man I know." Lily beamed. "I got accepted to nursing school. Full scholarship." Margaret gasped with delight. "James told me you were waiting to hear. Oh, this calls for a celebration." James shook his head. "We don't need to make a fuss." "Nonsense." Margaret was already reaching for her phone. "This is important." Within the hour, Margaret had arranged for the kitchen staff to bring a cake to the common room. She'd asked the activities director to play music, insisting it wasn't just for Lily but would brighten everyone's day. "Don't worry about the cost," she told James when he protested. "This brings me joy." The common room filled with residents, many who normally stayed in their rooms, now curious about the impromptu gathering. Mrs. Chen brought her knitting. Mr. Abernathy arrived in his wheelchair, oxygen tank in tow. The kitchen staff wheeled in a cart with a white cake decorated with blue frosting flowers. "Congratulations, Lily," was written in careful script across the top. "How did you manage this so quickly?" James whispered, amazement in his voice. Margaret winked. "Being Mrs. Lawson still opens a few doors." Lily stood shyly as Margaret called for everyone's attention. "Today we celebrate this wonderful young woman who has earned a full scholarship to nursing school. She'll be caring for people like us someday." The residents broke into applause. Mr. Abernathy called out, "We need more good nurses." Lily blushed. "I want to help people the way my grandpa does." James's eyes glistened as he wrapped an arm around his granddaughter's shoulders. Margaret watched them, her heart so full it might burst. This was what family should be: pride, support, celebration of each other's victories. As cake was passed around, residents shared their own stories of children and grandchildren. Mrs. Chen showed pictures of her grandson's baseball team. The music played softly in the background, Frank Sinatra, Margaret's favorite. Margaret sat between James and Lily, listening to the young woman's plans for school. For a precious moment, she forgot the sterile walls, the medical equipment, the children who had abandoned her. Here, now, she belonged. When Lily hugged her goodbye, whispering, "Thank you for making this special," Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. "You and your grandfather have made my days here special," she replied. "Today was my pleasure." As the party wound down, Margaret knew with certainty this joy, this feeling of family, was worth more than all her millions. The celebration had barely ended when Margaret spotted Susan standing in the doorway of the common room. Her daughter's eyes narrowed as she surveyed the seen cake crumbs on plates. James helping an elderly resident back to her room, the "Congratulations Lily" banner still hanging. Margaret felt her joy drain away like water down a sink. She straightened her shoulders and moved toward her daughter. "Susan, what a surprise to see you here." Susan's lips tightened into a thin line. "I've been calling the front desk for hours. They said you were unavailable at a party." She glanced pointedly at James, who was now gathering paper cups. "I didn't realize nursing homes held celebrations for the cleaning staff." "James' granddaughter received a full scholarship to nursing school," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "It was worth celebrating." Susan took her mother's arm, steering her away from the few remaining residents. "Mother, what are you doing? Getting involved with the janitor's family? People are talking." "People always talk, Susan." Margaret gently pulled her arm free. "James is my friend. His granddaughter is a lovely young woman with a bright future." "Friend?" Susan's voice rose. "He mops floors for a living. He's using you. Can't you see that? A lonely, wealthy woman, you're an easy target." The words stung like slaps. Margaret felt heat rise to her face. "That's quite enough. James has shown me more kindness in these few weeks than—" She stopped herself. "Then what, Mother? Then your own children? Is that what you were going to say?" Susan's eyes flashed with anger. We placed you here for your own good, in the best facility money could buy. You placed me here and forgot about me, Margaret said quietly. James remembers my name, my stories. He brings me flowers and reads to me. Susan stepped back, her expression hardening. So this is what it's come to? You're turning against your own family for a janitor who's clearly after your money? Margaret saw James hovering uncertainly by the door, concern etched across his face. She straightened to her full height, dignified even in her simple blue dress. James doesn't know about my money, Susan. He sees me not my bank account, something my children seem incapable of doing. Susan grabbed her purse from a nearby chair. I can see this was a waste of time. I came to check on you, but clearly you found new priorities. She turned to leave, then looked back. Don't expect me to pick up the pieces when you realize you've been taken advantage of. Susan, Margaret called, but her daughter was already striding down the hallway, heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. James approached cautiously. Everything all right, Miss Margaret? Just my daughter being herself, Margaret said, forcing a smile. Pay it no mind. Later that night, Margaret lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling. The joy of the afternoon celebration had been poisoned by Susan's words. She knew her daughter Susan wouldn't leave things alone. There would be phone calls, perhaps to the nursing home administrator, or worse. Margaret's heart fluttered uneasily in her chest. Her children had always been possessive of what they considered theirs, and they considered her fortune very much theirs already. The thought of them discovering her new will sent a wave of anxiety through her. Lord, give me strength, she whispered into the darkness. I've made my choice, and I'll stand by it. But even as she prayed, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that a storm was gathering, one that would soon break over them all. 2 days passed in uneasy quiet. Margaret noticed the staff watching James differently when he came to clean her room. Their smiles seemed forced, their eyes suspicious. James carried on with his work, but his shoulders hunched under the weight of their stares. They'll forget soon enough, Margaret assured him as he mopped her bathroom floor. People always find something new to gossip about. James nodded, wringing out his mop. Don't you worry about me, Miss Margaret. I've weathered worse storms. Margaret was arranging her Bible and reading glasses when the door burst open. Michael stormed in, Robert close behind. Their faces were twisted with rage. Mother, what have you done? Michael's voice boomed through the small room. He waved a piece of paper in his hand. Margaret's heart jumped. What are you talking about? Your will, Robert spat the words. Susan called the director after seeing you with him. He jabbed a finger toward James, who stood frozen by the bathroom door. They've been watching him. Nurse Mitchell saw you with your lawyer. James looked at Margaret, confusion clear in his eyes. Miss Margaret? Michael advanced on James. Chest puffed out. You think you're clever, don't you? Worming your way into a wealthy old woman's life, bringing flowers, playing the humble servant. I don't know what you are, James began. Shut up, Robert shouted. We know everything. You convinced our mother to change her will. $300 million to a janitor? You're nothing but a thief. James's eyes widened as he turned to Margaret. Miss Margaret, is this true? Margaret struggled to her feet, her hand clutching the bedside table for support. Stop it, both of you. James knows nothing about my will. This is between us. There's nothing between us anymore, Michael said coldly. You've betrayed your family for a con man. He's no con man. Margaret's voice shook with anger. James is the only person who's shown me real kindness since your father died. He deserves nothing. Robert lunged forward, grabbing James by his uniform shirt. You're fired. You understand? We're calling the police. Let him go, Margaret cried, stepping forward. Michael turned on her. You've lost your mind. This man has manipulated you. Can't you see that? No janitor gets a fortune, not our fortune. A strange pressure built in Margaret's chest. The room seemed to tilt. Please, she gasped. Please stop. The pressure exploded into searing pain. Margaret clutched at her chest, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps. The faces before her blurred. Mother? Michael's voice seemed far away. Margaret felt her knees buckle. The last thing she saw was James breaking free from Robert's grip, rushing toward her as darkness closed in. Call an ambulance, James shouted, catching Margaret as she fell. He lowered her gently to the floor, checking her pulse with trembling fingers. She's having a heart attack. Minutes later, paramedics rushed in with a stretcher. They worked quickly, attaching monitors, administering oxygen. BP's dropping. We need to move now, one called out. They wheeled Margaret out, Michael and Robert following, their anger momentarily forgotten in the face of crisis. James followed as far as they would let him, watching helplessly as they loaded Margaret into the ambulance. When they closed the doors, blocking her from view, he sank to his knees on the pavement. Please, Lord, he whispered, clasping his weathered hands together. Please save her. Not for the money, I never knew about any money, but because this world needs her kindness. Tears streaked down his face as the ambulance pulled away, sirens wailing. Please don't take her yet. The rhythmic beeping of machines filled the sterile hospital room. Margaret lay motionless beneath crisp white sheets, oxygen tubes running beneath her nose, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Her face, usually animated with warmth, looked pale and waxy under the harsh fluorescent lights. Michael paced at the foot of the bed while Susan sat stiffly in the chair by the window. Robert leaned against the wall, arms crossed. We need to talk to her lawyer, Michael said, keeping his voice low. There must be a way to contest the will. Susan glanced at their unconscious mother. The doctor said she might be able to hear us. So what? Robert snapped. It's her fault we're in this mess. $300 million to a janitor? She's clearly not in her right mind. We can prove undue influence, Michael continued, as if their mother wasn't lying between them fighting for her life. That janitor manipulated her when she was vulnerable. Susan twisted the strap of her designer purse. I knew something was wrong when I saw that celebration. He was parading his family in front of her, making her feel like part of it. We should have moved faster, Robert muttered. The minute the nurse called you, don't blame me, Susan hissed. I came right away, but she defended him. Our own mother chose a stranger over us. Michael stopped pacing. What matters now is damage control. If she recovers, when she recovers, Susan corrected half-heartedly. We need to have our strategy ready. I've already called Peterson at the firm. He says we can argue diminished capacity. The machines continue their steady rhythm, indifferent to their plotting. What about her personal effects? Robert asked suddenly. Did anyone think to grab her Bible? She's always writing notes in that thing. Susan shook her head. The paramedics were focused on keeping her alive, Robert. Well, someone should get it, he insisted. There might be evidence of what that janitor was doing. The discussion devolved into bickering about who should return to the nursing home, who should contact which lawyer, and how to divide the potential legal costs. None of them noticed the slight flutter of Margaret's eyelids, or the single tear that escaped from the corner of her eye. 3 floors below, in a small hospital chapel, James Walker knelt on the hard wooden kneeler, his work uniform still stained from the day's labor. His large, calloused hands were clasped so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Lord, he whispered, his voice breaking, I don't ask for much in this life. You know that. But please, please spare Miss Margaret. She's got so much love left to give this world. The chapel was empty, except for him, bathed in the soft glow of candles and colored light filtering through the stained glass. A small cross hung on the wall before him. I didn't know about any will, he continued. You know my heart. Lord, I never wanted anything from her except friendship. James closed his eyes, remembering Margaret's smile when he brought her wildflowers. The way she listened intently when he spoke of his granddaughter, how she made everyone in that nursing home feel valuable again. She taught me that kindness can bloom anywhere, even in the saddest places. His shoulders shook with a silent sob. Her children don't see who she really is. They don't know the woman who shares her cookies with the other residents who never get visitors. The woman who remembers every staff member's name. A nurse passed by the open chapel door, pausing briefly at the sight of the janitor in prayer. I'm not asking for myself, Lord, James whispered. But this world needs more Miss Margarets, not fewer. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. And if you see fit to take her home to you, please let me say goodbye first. The chapel remained silent except for his whispered prayers, rising up like incense in the quiet sanctuary. A faint beeping wormed its way into Margaret's consciousness. Her eyelids felt impossibly heavy, as if weighed down by sand. The antiseptic smell of the hospital room reached her first, then the dull ache in her chest. Can't believe you didn't think to secure her financial records before. Me? You were supposed to be watching her visitors. Both of you shut up. This is getting us nowhere. The familiar voices of her children cut through the fog in Margaret's mind. With tremendous effort, she forced her eyes open. The harsh fluorescent light stabbed at her vision as she took in the scene. Her 3 children huddled near the foot of her bed, too engrossed in their argument to notice she was awake. The janitor probably suggested the whole thing, Michael said, gesturing angrily. People like that are always looking for vulnerable, wealthy seniors. Susan nodded. The nursing home staff should never have allowed him so much time alone with her. We'll sue them too, Robert added, checking his watch impatiently. Margaret felt a clarity she hadn't experienced in years. The veil had been lifted, and she saw her children exactly as they were, strangers who shared her blood but not her heart. A lifetime of excusing their behavior, of believing maternal love would be enough, crumbled in that moment. She drew a shallow breath, her voice emerging as a hoarse whisper. Stop fighting. I know the truth now. The 3 of them whirled around, faces registering shock before quickly rearranging into expressions of concern. Mother! Susan rushed to her side. Thank goodness you're awake. How are you feeling? Michael asked, not quite meeting her eyes. Margaret didn't answer their questions. I heard every word, she said, each syllable deliberate despite her weakness. Every single word while I was lying here. Robert stepped forward. Mother, you were unconscious. You couldn't have. Call my lawyer, Margaret interrupted, her voice gaining strength from her resolve. Now, the siblings exchanged nervous glances. Mother, you're not thinking clearly, Susan tried, patting Margaret's hand condescendingly. You've had a heart attack. You need to rest. Margaret pulled her hand away. Either you call Harold Winters right now, or I'll ask the nurse to do it. Something in her tone, a steely determination they rarely heard, made them realize she wouldn't be dissuaded. Fine, Michael relented, pulling out his phone. But this conversation isn't over. As he stepped into the hallway to make the call, Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Where's James? She asked. That janitor? Susan scoffed. Security wouldn't let him up. Family only. He's more family to me than you 3 have been in years, Margaret said quietly. Get him. Now. For once, they didn't argue. 20 minutes later, the door to Margaret's room opened slowly. James stood hesitantly in the doorway, his work clothes rumpled, his face lined with worry. When he saw Margaret awake, looking at him, something broke inside him. Miss Margaret, he whispered, tears welling up and spilling down his weathered cheeks. Come in, James, she said, holding out her frail hand. He crossed the room in 3 strides, taking her offered hand between both of his, tears streaming freely down his face. I thought I lost you, he said, his voice cracking with emotion. Margaret's children stood awkwardly by the window, watching this display of genuine feeling, something foreign to their calculations and schemes. Not yet, Margaret said with the ghost of a smile. God's not finished with me quite yet. Harold Winters arrived an hour later, his silver hair immaculately combed, carrying a leather briefcase that looked as old as he was. The small hospital room suddenly felt crowded with the addition of the attorney, Mrs. Lawson. He nodded respectfully to Margaret, before acknowledging the others with a more reserved, Michael, Susan, Robert. James tried to stand, preparing to leave. I should wait outside while you discuss family matters. No. Margaret's voice was soft but firm. Please stay, James. This concerns you. Harold cleared his throat, pulling reading glasses from his breast pocket. I've brought the will as requested. Are you certain you want me to read it now, Margaret? Yes, she replied, her eyes fixed on her children. Everyone needs to hear it. Michael stepped forward. Is this really necessary, Mother? You're still recovering. Read it, Harold, Margaret insisted. The lawyer opened his briefcase, retrieving a document sealed with blue backing. He adjusted his glasses and began to read in a formal tone. I, Margaret Eleanor Lawson, being of sound mind and body, hereby revoke all previous wills and testaments. The legal preamble continued, with Harold's voice steady and clear. James stood awkwardly by Margaret's bedside, confusion evident on his face. The children shifted impatiently. And to the distribution of my estate, valued at approximately $300 million, Harold continued, including all properties, investments, and personal effects. I hereby bequeath the entirety to James Walker, in recognition of his kindness, dignity, and compassion. The silence lasted precisely 2 seconds before erupting. What? Susan shrieked, her face contorting. This is absurd. Michael slammed his fist against the wall. She's been manipulated. Robert lunged toward James. You conniving bastard. What did you do to her? That's our money! Susan's voice rose to a near scream. Our birthright. We'll contest this, Michael shouted, pointing at Harold. She's clearly not of sound mind. You can't do this. Robert's face had turned an alarming shade of red. Throughout the outburst, James stood frozen, his mouth open in shock, looking from the lawyer to Margaret and back again. Miss Margaret, I didn't know, he stammered. Margaret raised her hand weakly, and remarkably, the room fell quiet. He gave me love when you gave me nothing, she said, each word measured and clear despite her frailty. When you abandoned me in that nursing home, James truly saw me as a person worthy of respect and kindness, not as a fortune to be claimed or an inconvenience to be managed. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the hospital machines seemed to quiet their beeping. But mother, Susan whispered, tears forming, we're your children. Yes, Margaret acknowledged, a profound sadness in her eyes. And I loved you with everything I had. I would have given you anything, not just my money, but my heart. All I wanted in return was to be treated with dignity in my final years. James knelt beside Margaret's bed, his weathered hands trembling as they held hers. I can't accept this, he whispered. It's too much. Margaret smiled at him. You already gave me something priceless, James. You made me feel human again. Harold Winters closed his briefcase with a decisive click. The will is legally binding and properly executed. Mrs. Lawson underwent thorough cognitive assessment before signing, should you choose to contest. I have extensive documentation of her competence. The room remained in stunned silence, the weight of Margaret's decision hanging in the air like an invisible presence, both a judgment and a final act of maternal teaching that none had expected. 2 days after the reading of the will, the Lakeview Chronicle ran the headline, Nursing Home Janitor inherits steel magnate's fortune. By nightfall, news vans lined the quiet street outside Peaceful Pines Nursing Home. This is Diane Reynolds reporting live, where local janitor James Walker has become the unlikely heir to the Lawson steel fortune. The reporter's voice carried across the evening news as residents gathered around the television in the common room. James ducked through the employee entrance, hoping to avoid the cameras. He'd taken 2 days off after the hospital confrontation, but couldn't afford to miss more work. His supervisor, Mr. Hendricks, intercepted him in the hallway. James, there you are. Hendricks extended his hand with an enthusiasm never before directed at the janitor. Let me know if you need anything at all. Just need to finish my shift, sir, James replied quietly, reaching for his mop. Hendricks laughed nervously. Surely you don't intend to keep working here? James met his eyes steadily. I've got 3 more hours on today's schedule. As James pushed his cart down the hall, he noticed staff members whispering, their eyes following him. Nurse Jenkins, who'd previously ignored his existence, rushed to hold the door open. Mr. Walker, she smiled warmly. Can I get you some coffee? Back at the county courthouse, Michael Lawson slammed his fist on his attorney's desk. I don't care what it costs. Contest the will on every possible ground. Mental incompetence, undue influence, everything. The attorney sighed. Mr. Lawson, I've reviewed the documents. Your mother's lawyer was exceedingly thorough. Multiple physicians certified her mental capacity. There were independent witnesses. The will is virtually bulletproof. She was manipulated, Susan insisted, mascara streaking down her cheeks. That janitor worked his way into her life when she was vulnerable. The problem, the attorney explained carefully, is that you left her there for 3 months with only 2 brief visits. Meanwhile, according to nursing staff interviews, Mr. Walker spent time with her daily, brought her flowers, read to her. With our money, Robert shouted. Our inheritance! The lawsuit was filed that afternoon anyway, and by evening made the local news. Outside Margaret's hospital room, James sat with his granddaughter Lily, who'd rushed home from college when he called. "Grandpa, people are saying you are worth millions now," she whispered. James shook his head. "None of that matters. I'm worried about Miss Margaret." Inside the room, Margaret was sitting up, looking at a newspaper. Her recovery had been remarkable, fueled perhaps by newfound purpose. The doctor had just left after upgrading her condition to stable. "Come in," she called. Having heard their voices, James entered hesitantly, Lily behind him. "How are you feeling today, Miss Margaret?" "Better, seeing you." She smiled, then noticed Lily. "And who's this lovely young lady?" "My granddaughter, Lily, the nursing student I told you about." Margaret's eyes brightened. "The one working so hard for her future. Come closer, dear." As Lily approached, Margaret took her hand. "Your grandfather is a remarkable man." "I know," Lily said softly. "But Grandpa's upset about all the attention. He says he never wanted your money." Margaret nodded. "I believe that. That's precisely why he deserves it." Outside the hospital, a crowd of reporters waited. Inside the nursing home, residents shared stories about James' kindness over the years. And across town, in 3 separate houses, the Lawson children seethed with a rage that would fuel months of bitter court battles, all destined to fail against the simple, unassailable truth of a mother's final wish. A week later, Margaret returned to the nursing home, her body still weak, but her spirit stronger than ever. The staff had prepared a small welcome back party with punch and cookies in the common room. But what touched her most was the handmade card signed by residents who once barely spoke to her. James knocked gently on her door that afternoon, carrying a manila folder. "Come in," Margaret called, her voice tired but warm. He entered with his usual quiet grace, though something in his demeanor had changed. Not pride, Margaret noted, but purpose, a calm determination that straightened his shoulders. "Miss Margaret, if you're feeling up to it, I'd like to talk about something important." She patted the chair beside her bed. "I've been waiting for this conversation." James settled into the seat, carefully placing the folder on his lap. His weathered hands, calloused from years of labor, trembled slightly as he opened it. "I've been doing some thinking." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "This money, your money, is too much for one person, especially someone like me who's gotten by just fine all these years." Margaret watched him, saying nothing. "I talked with a financial advisor. She helped me put together some ideas." He pulled out several sketched plans. "What if instead of using it for myself, we created something lasting? A community center in your name, with programs for folks who need a hand up, not a handout." He showed her architectural drawings of a building with wide windows and gardens surrounding it. "And scholarships," he continued, his voice gaining confidence. "For kids like Lily who work 3 jobs just to pay tuition. Kids who might otherwise never get their chance." Margaret's eyes filled with tears as he laid out his vision, not just a building, but a place where elderly could find companionship, where children could access books and computers, where single parents could find affordable daycare. "The Margaret Lawson Community Center," James said softly. "A place that brings people together instead of leaving them alone when they need each other most." A tear slipped down Margaret's cheek. "You could buy yourself a mansion, travel the world." James shook his head. "What would I do rattling around some big house? My apartment has everything I need." He looked at her directly. "This money can do so much more than just make one old janitor comfortable." Margaret reached for his hand, her fingers light as paper against his skin. "Then my life's work is not in vain," she whispered. For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of possibilities settling between them. Then Margaret straightened, a flash of her old steel returning. "I want to help plan it," she said firmly, "while I still can. Promise me that." James smiled, relief washing over his face. "I was hoping you'd say that. I've set up a meeting with architects next week. Thought maybe we could have it here in the sunroom." "Perfect," Margaret nodded, her mind already racing with ideas. "And James?" "Yes, Miss Margaret? Make sure there are plenty of flowers. A garden where people can sit and remember that beauty exists even in hard places." James tucked the plans back into his folder, his heart full. The fortune that had caused so much chaos would now become something neither of them had been able to create alone, a legacy of compassion that would outlive them both. Summer bloomed into autumn, painting the nursing home gardens in shades of amber and gold. Margaret sat on her favorite bench beneath the maple tree, a light shawl around her shoulders to ward off the crisp October breeze. Her body had grown frailer, but her eyes sparkled with a serenity that hadn't been there before. "Miss Lawson, would you like some tea?" A young nurse approached, no longer the hurried caregiver who once barely made eye contact. "That would be lovely, dear. And please, call me Margaret." The nurse smiled and hurried off. Margaret watched as two residents worked nearby, planting bulbs that would sleep through winter and emerge in spring flowers she might not be around to see. Yet the thought brought peace rather than sadness. 3 times a week, the architects visited with updated plans for the community center. Margaret insisted these meetings take place outdoors when weather permitted. Something about watching nature's cycles while planning for the future felt right to her. The story of her inheritance decision had traveled through town like wildfire. Her children's lawsuits had failed one by one, each judge finding her perfectly sound. Michael, Susan, and Robert had stopped visiting altogether. Their absence, once a wound, now felt like the scab that forms before healing begins. "Grandma Margaret," a cheerful voice called across the lawn. Lily, James's granddaughter, hurried toward her, textbooks clutched to her chest. At 19, she radiated youth and possibility. James followed behind, carrying a small basket. "We brought blackberry cobbler," Lily announced, sitting beside Margaret. "Made it this morning before my anatomy class." James settled on Margaret's other side. "She's top of her nursing program," he said, quiet pride warming his voice. "Of course she is." Margaret patted Lily's hand. "You have your grandfather's determination." The 3 of them shared cobbler, while Lily described her studies. Other residents gradually joined them, drawn by laughter and the sweet smell of dessert. What had once been a lonely bench became the heart of the garden. These afternoons sustained Margaret. Each day brought small joys. Residents who once stared vacantly at television screens now asked her to help with crossword puzzles or to listen to stories about their grandchildren. The nursing home director had even asked her advice about improving community activities. "The blueprints are finalized," James told her one Wednesday, spreading papers across her lap. "Construction begins next month." Margaret traced the outline of the building with trembling fingers. Will there be enough light in the library? Floor-to-ceiling windows on the east wall, morning sunshine for the early readers. She nodded approval. "And the daycare playground? Accessible equipment for children of all abilities," James assured her, "just like you wanted." Later, as sunset painted the sky in watercolor strokes, Margaret watched James and Lily walk to the parking lot. They turned to wave, and she lifted her hand in response. The hole her children had left remained, but it no longer ached as it once had. In its place grew something she hadn't expected to find in her final chapter, a chosen family built on kindness rather than obligation. That night, Margaret added a new note to her Bible. "The Lord makes a family for the lonely." She closed the worn book and placed it on her nightstand, beside a fresh bunch of wildflowers James had brought from his garden. Outside her window, the stars emerged one by one, bright pinpricks of light in the gathering darkness. Margaret watched them, content in the knowledge that even in winter, seeds wait patiently for their season to bloom. Winter arrived with gentle persistence, dusting the nursing home grounds with snow that caught the morning light like scattered diamonds. Margaret's strength ebbed with the shortening days. Her walks in the garden grew shorter until they stopped altogether. One Tuesday morning, Margaret woke with a certainty that settled deep in her bones. She asked the nurse to call James. "Tell him it's important," she whispered, her voice thin as tissue paper. James arrived within the hour, snow still clinging to his coat. Worry etched across his weathered face. "Miss Margaret?" He took her fragile hand between his calloused ones. "What can I do for you?" Margaret's smile was faint but genuine. "Sit with me a while, James. I think it's time for us to talk." The afternoon light filtered through her curtains, casting long shadows across the room. On her nightstand, the plans for the community center rested beside her Bible, cornerstones of a legacy nearly complete. "I've been blessed to see spring and summer again," Margaret said, each word measured and deliberate. But I won't see the center open. James started to protest, but she shook her head. It's all right. We both know it's true. She patted his hand. I wanted to thank you, James. Not for what you're going to do with the money. That's your path now. I wanted to thank you for seeing me when I was invisible. A tear traced down James's cheek, disappearing into the collar of his worn flannel shirt. You gave me dignity when my own children stripped it away, she continued. That gift is worth more than any fortune. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft flakes dancing on currents of air. Margaret watched them for a moment before turning back to James. Would you read to me one last time? James reached for her Bible, opening to where a ribbon marked Psalm 23. His voice, steady and deep, filled the small room with ancient words of comfort. Margaret closed her eyes, letting the familiar passage wash over her. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. When he finished, Margaret opened her eyes. James, will you pray with me? They bowed their heads together. James's words, simple but heartfelt. Margaret added her own silent prayers for James and Lily, for the community center that would bear her name, and even for her children, that they might someday understand what truly mattered. I'm not afraid, she told him when they finished. I'm ready to see Edward again and my parents. A peaceful smile touched her lips. Perhaps even your Martha will be there to greet me. James stayed until evening, sharing quiet memories of the past year. When the night nurse came in, he reluctantly rose to leave. I'll see you tomorrow, Miss Margaret. You've been a blessing, James Walker, she replied, her voice barely audible. Never forget that. That night, Margaret opened her Bible one last time. She ran her fingers over the worn pages, over the notes she'd added through years of joy and sorrow. She read until her eyes grew heavy, the book resting open on her chest as sleep claimed her. Outside her window, the snowfall continued, covering the world in pristine white. Margaret Lawson drew her final breath just before midnight, slipping away with the same quiet grace that had defined her life. She was smiling. Spring burst forth in a riot of colors across the town square. Red ribbons fluttered in the gentle breeze as hundreds gathered before the gleaming new building. The Margaret Lawson Community Center stood proud against the cloudless blue sky, its red brick facade and wide windows welcoming all who approached. James fidgeted with his tie, the first one he'd worn since Margaret's funeral. His granddaughter Lily stood beside him in her nursing school scrubs, having come straight from her clinical rotation. You ready, Grandpa? Lily squeezed his hand. James nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. The crowd before him represented every corner of the community. Nursing home residents in wheelchairs, families with young children, teachers, laborers, and business owners. Even a few curious reporters lingered at the edges, cameras ready. Mayor Wilson stepped to the microphone. Today, we celebrate not just a building, but a woman whose final act of love transformed our community forever. James barely heard the speech that followed. His mind drifted to that snowy night when Margaret had slipped away. The nursing staff had found her peaceful, her Bible still open on her chest. He'd kept that Bible, her final gift to him. And now, the mayor concluded, I invite James Walker and his granddaughter Lily to cut the ribbon and officially open the Margaret Lawson Community Center. The oversized scissors felt awkward in James's hands. Lily placed her fingers next to his, and together they cut the red ribbon. Applause erupted as it fluttered to the ground. This way, Mr. Walker. A young woman guided him inside. The foyer opened into a sunlit atrium where a magnificent mural covered the far wall. Margaret's face, youthful yet wise, smiled down at them all. The artist had captured her perfectly, the gentle eyes, the hint of mischief in her smile, the dignity that no circumstance could diminish. It's perfect, James whispered. Lily led him through the building past the library with its children's corner and senior reading room, the computer lab where classes would be held, the scholarship office already processing applications. A plaque beside each room explained how Margaret's legacy was supported for generations to come. Children darted around them, already claiming the space as their own. A little girl with pigtails paused before the mural, looking up at Margaret's face with wide-eyed wonder. Was she a queen? She asked James. He knelt beside her, knees protesting. No, honey, she was something better. She was a woman who learned that love is the greatest gift we can give. The child nodded solemnly before racing off to join her friends. As afternoon faded toward evening, the crowd thinned. James found himself alone in the atrium, staring up at Margaret's face. The setting sun cast golden light across the mural, bringing it to life. Behind him, children's laughter echoed from the playroom, punctuated by the gentle voices of volunteers reading stories. The sounds of life, of joy, of community, exactly what Margaret had wanted. James reached out, his fingertips brushing the mural's edge. "You'll never be forgotten, Miss Margaret," he whispered. "Not as long as this place stands. Not as long as there are people who remember what it means to truly see one another." He stood there a moment longer, surrounded by the living testament to a woman who had found her greatest purpose in her final days. Then, smiling, James turned away from the mural and walked toward the laughter, ready to continue the work Margaret had begun. If you enjoy the story of Margaret Lawson, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.